Hi, and welcome to this edition of Fresh Hope for Mental Health. Our mission here at Fresh Hope for Mental Health is to empower you to live well in spite of your mental health challenge by sharing insights through interviews, practical tools for living well, encouragement, and courage for overcoming all from a Christian perspective. And now, here's your host, Pastor Brad Hoefs.
Hello, my friend, and welcome to this edition of Fresh Hope for Mental Health. I'm Brad Hoefs, your host. Our purpose here on Fresh Hope for Mental Health is to empower you to live a faith-filled, full, and rich life in spite of having a mental health diagnosis. And today we have somebody who really specializes in helping people live a rich and full life from a faith-filled perspective, and that is Robert Vore, who's a therapist, a counselor, who works with youth and adolescents and young adults to help move past barriers and live into their most whole and healthy lives. I like how you say that here on your website, Robert.
Yeah.
He says he works with areas of depression, suicidality, anxiety, school, social concerns, transitions, and more. And he also offers training for churches and ministries and other groups wanting to learn more about mental health. Thank you for being here today with me, Robert, and I really appreciate your time. Tell us
Absolutely.
about who you are and how you got involved in doing this.
Yeah, well, first, obviously, I'd like to say thank you for having me on, and all the work that you do is, I have no doubt the amount of people that it's helping that maybe you're not even aware of, the ripple effects and things like that. So I appreciate you and the work that you do.
Thanks.
So I guess as far as me, it always kind of makes me chuckle when kind of people are reading the, the formal description there online or whatever.
Yeah.
It's, so I'm a therapist in the Atlanta area. I'm a licensed counselor, which is obviously one of the ways that you go about being a therapist.
Right.
I've been doing that for a little bit, focusing mostly on adolescents and young adults, like you said. So kind of 12 to 30-ish range is where I like kind of to work with most passionately. But kind of beyond that, so I worked in, I guess if you go all the way back, those years of my life were some of the hardest, right? Of wrestling with depression, wrestling with suicidal thoughts myself, throughout kind of middle, high school, a little bit into college, right? And a lot of wrestling of how do I reconcile that with my faith, right? If we believe in a God who is good, then how does my brain kind of function in this way, right?
Absolutely.
Things like that. And the hope that we talk about, how is that tangible in any sense? 'Cause it's all well and good to sing about victory, but then kind of day to day, you're feeling something entirely different. What do we do with that? And so, in college, majored in something else entirely. Actually, my undergrad is in music, so there you go.
Okay.
But so wasn't really planning on going in this direction, but as college went on, served in some churches, ended up when I graduated working at a college ministry. So I really love college students. My wife and I have been involved in college ministry ever since then, actually, in a number of ways. But so during that time period started being pretty honest on kind of social media and things like that about mental health and reading more about it just in terms of myself and it being this area that I thought, hey, this is really interesting. Did some work with a nonprofit at one point that focused on those as well. And so kind of came to have maybe a bigger view of God and how he fit into that picture.
Sure.
And so started posting about that type of thing and got just an overwhelming response.
Isn't it amazing?
Hey, thank you for just talking about these, right? I wasn't an expert or anything, but just being open and saying something about these things. And so as I went through, a couple of years of working in ministry, college ministry in particular, found that people came, both in the churches that I served and in the ministries that I worked at, people came to faith leaders with those types of things, right? Hey,
Mm-hmm.
I'm wrestling with depression. I'm wrestling with anxiety. I'm using self-injury as a
Yep.
coping mechanism, or I'm having suicidal thoughts. And people were turning to faith leaders because that's who they trusted
Mm-hmm.
in a variety of settings, which makes sense.
Right.
And the response, by and large, was kind of a, "Oh no, what do we do with this?" Right?
Right.
Like it was scary to the faith leaders, and so even the ministries that I worked at, other staff members would come to me, and I wasn't an expert, but they knew that I posted about it some, and
Sure.
had
Sure.
even just this tiny sliver of something in this area, and they would come to me and say, "Hey, what do we do here? What, can you give
Yeah.
me anything whatsoever so
Yep.
I can help better?" And so it just came to me that, how do we equip those people who people are turning to? They're turning to faith leaders. We have some research that says this, that
Mm-hmm.
most people turn to a faith leader much more likely than, going to a counselor's office first, or a psychiatrist, or anything like that.
Right.
And we have kind of a separate chunk of research that says faith leaders say, well, we don't really know. Like, we
Right.
feel pretty unprepared in this area.
Yeah,
We don't really
it's
know what
like
to do.
3% of faith leaders feel prepared to address
Mhm.
it. It's pretty
Yeah.
pretty astounding.
Yeah. And so to me, personally and professionally, I moved into the area of doing counseling kind of on an individual basis. But then I also try to be an advocate for, okay, how do we help the people, the faith leaders that people are turning to anyway, if they're kind of doing like the triage, right? They're like kind of the first
Right.
point of contact. How do we equip them better to have those conversations, not to be full-fledged mental health practitioners, because that's not what they're trying to do, but how do we at least equip them with enough comfortability and say, hey, you can have these conversations. Here's kind of what you need to know, and things like
Exactly.
that. And then also kind of build that bridge. So, hey, you can trust mental health professionals. You can refer, because there's kind of, historically been a disconnect from both sides on that
Mm-hmm.
relationship. And so that's what I try to do, kind of my after hours activities, I guess.
Right. Well,
Obviously, it
you
doesn't break down
offer.
that simply, but
Yeah. Well, and what's great is you offer training, it looks like, to churches and to leaders, as well as you and I forget the doctor's name, Holly Oxhandler.
Oxandler.
Yeah.
Hmm.
You two have a podcast, CXMH, really a podcast that does much of what you're talking about.
Yeah.
So talk to me a little bit about the training and that podcast. And I'm
Yeah.
certain that my listeners, by the way, those of you listening to this, check out that podcast, CXMH, and you can get it probably on any place where podcasts are available, I'm assuming.
A large chunk of my heartbeat is, how do we help those people, right? And so I spend a lot of time talking to ministers, college ministers, people that work in churches, volunteers, youth pastors, right? Things like that.
Mm-hmm.
And trying to say, hey, what is it that you would need to kind of engage with this better? And so anytime I can have that conversation, I'm always looking to do that. And I guess it seems to me, if we are all in the business of trying to offer hope and healing, right, which
Yep.
is what we're trying to do, then working together makes sense, right? We don't need to kind of divide these things out necessarily.
Right.
Obviously, there's situations that require different skill sets. That's also, scriptural, but so I offer suicide prevention trainings. It comes with a certificate that's through an institute that does that type of thing.
Right.
But then I also do trainings that are pretty customizable. Most often, I work a lot with youth ministries or college ministries. Those are maybe just because of who my clientele tends to be. They hear of
Sure.
me more, but so a youth pastor will say, hey, can you come at the beginning of the year and do a training for all my volunteers, all my adult volunteers? And we just want to know, how to have these hard conversations. What is it that we're kind of up against, right? So what are youth today struggling with? What are kind of the rates of things? And practically, how do we help? Where's the limits to what we should do? Things like that,
Yep.
right? And so
Yep.
I can kind of customize it to whatever. I usually try to say, what are kind of your three biggest questions that you have? But things like that, I mean,
Mm-hmm.
I really love those types of things, that like those kind of teaching times where I get to interact with people and hear what it is that they want to know and what it looks like in their context to say, hey, I have students coming to me with this. I have, people in my congregation coming to me with
Exactly.
these things. What do I do here?
Sure.
And so I have this kind of picture in my mind of mental health as a topic of like this scary, dark, like mysterious forest that's like out, I don't, like Harry Potter or something, right? Just like this big. And so faith leaders, by and large, what I hear is like, well, we have like, it's very intimidating. It's like this whole big thing. Sometimes we've even been told like, hey, butt out.
Right. Well,
and so we just don't,
that's
we
what
just
I
don't
got.
even go in there.
At the
And
seminary, much what I've got.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. But so if we can say, hey, can we shine a little bit of light in there, clear some of this fog out? Maybe there are some parts that are a little maybe treacherous or hard to navigate, but that's part of being human. And hey, you are in this with us. It doesn't have to be this huge, intimidating, scary thing where you say, we're just not going to touch it at all. Because, as well as I do, 1 in 4, 1 in 5, somewhat one of those two American adults, in a given year are encountering a mental health struggle of some kind. And so if you say, we're just not going to touch that, you're missing a huge source of pain and challenge and things that your people are going through.
It's a crisis in our culture, and yet churches, it's a crisis you can't see very well, or, it's not like a tornado went through the town and now, or whatever.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So that's, and then the podcast is kind of the same thing, but on a larger scale. If I can have conversations with people that are smarter than me, that are experts in particular areas, right? So Holly, Dr. Oxhandler, is the co-host starting in season 3, and then we actually just talked the other day, kind of brainstorming for season 4 that will start in a bit. But so it's much of the same types of things where we can go a little bit deeper in particular topics, and they're just constantly available. So if you say, hey, I want to learn more about obsessive compulsive disorder, right? OCD. We have an episode where we talked to an OCD expert, right? If you want to learn more about bipolar, or things like that. And so we try to make it, again, kind of that bridge where we touch on faith, we touch on mental health, but we try to break it down into translate some of the maybe higher academic things into here's an hour conversation around this. And it's at kind of a level that most people can listen to and understand, and hopefully walk away and say, I feel better equipped to understand and help the people that are right beside me.
Yeah, absolutely. What I really like is the fact that you've done ministry and you know how people come and trust their faith leaders for help when they come for help. And so you get the fact that most of us that are pastors, and we're on the front lines, we're the triage or the ER responders or the paramedics, if you will. And there is some mental health stuff we have to be somewhat savvy on or know about. And it isn't always as easy as just telling somebody you need to see a doctor. Because they don't always like hearing that right away. So you kind of got to get them to a point where they're ready to go see a doctor.
Right. And that's such a long process oftentimes, right? There's a bigger conversation to be had about how hard it is to get mental health care, particularly in our country. But, if you say, well, you're in kind of this emotional mental health thing, here, go see a counselor. That could take a really long time, and it costs some money. And that's what I do for a living. So I'm not, I'm not bashing therapists in general, but the system is hard to navigate oftentimes. And so
what I find is a lot of larger, fast-growing churches around the country are really doing what I would call, I don't know what you call it, but they kind of have this idea that if somebody in the congregation has a problem, there's a couple of people they can see in the church, and then they right away send them to the right place or whatever. I don't know. Is the younger generation doing that more or not? But my experience with people is that you got to have pastoral care along the way there and walk alongside of them. And sometimes you got to walk with them for a while before they even really get the help.
Yeah, and if you think about anything else, right? If someone came in with a broken leg or a diagnosis of some kind, right, you would say, "Hey, we're gonna help you get, the from the medical side, we're gonna help you get the professional care of someone who really
Mm-hmm.
knows the ins and outs of this, but also we're going to check in on you. We're going to talk through kind of the spiritual ramifications of this, right? I mean, if someone
Mm-hmm.
says, how could God let my leg be broken? You maybe are more equipped to handle that as a pastor than your local counselor who
Mm-hmm.
doesn't have theological training, who might have a different set of beliefs, or, there's some ethical things on different, how much you want to talk about faith in sessions,
Right.
things like that. But so uh, much like faith leaders feel, kind of maybe not great about diving into what they feel unqualified in mental health conversations, the flip side is true. And so
Yep.
I think both of those, again, kind of working together, right? Saying,
Right.
hey, you're going through this treatment, you're doing things. Also, how can we as a community, as a faith leader, as someone who has a spiritual voice in your life, also come alongside you and
Absolutely.
help be part of that team of people who are I mean, that's what community is, right? It's not just, well,
Right.
go over there and then,
I
well, we've
know.
done our bit and passed you on,
Yeah.
where, hey, how can I walk alongside you here?
In my experience is if you're not careful, some people will say, well, I came to you for help, and blow you off and blow off going to somebody for help. I've had many experiences through 34, 35 years of doing this that sometimes you really have to work with somebody for a while to help them know that it's time to go to the doctor. It's time to go
Yeah,
to the therapist. And then you don't just drop them off at the hospital
right,
and say,
right,
catch you later. When you're better, I'll see you in church.
right.
you
Yeah,
know?
you say, hey, here you go, but also I'm going to check in. Hey, how was
Yep,
that? How's it going? Can I bring you a
exactly.
casserole or, I don't
Yep,
know. I don't think we do casseroles anymore, but, uh,
yep,
you know,
yep, absolutely. Well, talk to me about suicide and suicide prevention and some of the things that you are finding there. And that's probably the scariest of all topics for
yeah,
many pastors and others. And maybe if you could, and this is just off the top of my head here, but one of the issues I'm finding more and more that we as faith leaders want to sugarcoat pain for people. And
yeah,
what we do is we really kind of cap off and want to put a Bible passage on top of the pain
yeah,
and hope on top of the pain, and the pain doesn't go away for people unless they process it. So how does that
yeah,
how's all that connect? Can you kind
yeah,
of
yeah. I mean, obviously this is a topic that a lot of people are very personally connected to in
yes.
a variety of ways, right? And we are seeing suicide rates having risen the past handful of years. I work a
Mm-hmm.
lot with youth, and there's a lot of concern there about our youth and the way that things are going there. In terms of suicide prevention, right? I mean, I think the kind of the big broad strokes that we need are to be more comfortable talking about things, right?
Mm-hmm.
So suicide, even saying it, for a lot of people, like has kind of this emotional weight, which I definitely understand.
Mm-hmm.
But if someone comes to you and says, "Hey, I'm having these thoughts," and kind of your instinct is, "Okay, I'm going to freak out and call 911 and all that," then
Right.
they're not going to come talk to you, right? Because it's not
Exactly.
safe. And it's hard to be mad at people for not talking about things that they've been shown are unsafe to talk about,
Yep.
you know? And so
Yep.
I think talking about things more, even on the front end, I remember when I was suicidal and went to youth group,
Yeah.
nobody ever said, "Hey, don't talk about these things," but they were the whole area of mental health and I mean, obviously suicide, right, was never talked about whatsoever.
Oh,
And so
absolutely.
how do I know that that's a place that these things are allowed to be talked about?
Yep. Yep.
And so I think talking about them more, which again I understand is kind of intimidating. If you're a
Mm-hmm.
faith leader, you say, "Well, I'm not just gonna randomly talk about suicide," but so kind of opening those doors to those conversations, knowing kind of where to go from there. So if somebody does talk to you about that type of thing, right? So like not freaking out, like I mentioned, but maybe having a couple resources on hand. Okay, well, I know this counselor and I trust them, right? That's an easier sell than go find a counselor yourself. Knowing local hotlines to call, things like that, if in case, if it is a crisis, then you probably need to call a local hotline or things like that. But knowing some things like that, but even just being okay having those conversations where you don't have the answers, right? And I think that's where we get into, you mentioned some of kind of the Bible verses and things like that. And I think we as people who want to help people, our typical response is like, can I offer a solution here to make you feel better?
Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
And that instinct is part good, obviously, but I think part of it is our own, hey, I'm uncomfortable with this tension. I'm uncomfortable with someone sitting in front of me crying and me not being able to do anything, right? Like we don't like that feeling. And I think that requires some kind of setting aside of a little bit of pride and ego, right? To say, hey, I can't fix this. And so what I'm going to do is just be with you in this, And
I'm going to hear your pain. And there's something about knowing that somebody is listening and not necessarily understanding, but it helps that person process their pain. It helps them pour it out. I just think we need in the church to understand, we don't even understand how to lament, pour out your pain to God. It's okay, but life is full of pain.
Right. Yeah. I think, the book of Job is one of my absolute favorites for exactly this reason, right? Because Job, obviously a lot of things happen, and hopefully people know kind of the basic setup. A lot of things happen where Job's life sucks, right?
Yep.
And his friends show up, and Job, there's this really interesting process where Job is lamenting to God, right? And there's a lot of anger in it and sadness and things like that. And Job's friends show up and they sit with him for a couple of days. And then you see this really weird pattern where his friends start trying to offer explanations, right?
Oh, yeah.
Well, this is happening because of this, and if you would just do this.
Yep.
And you can track it throughout the book where, because it's this back and forth between one friend and Job and then another friend and Job, and you can track it where Job spends less and less time turning to God with his frustrations and pain and lament, and more time arguing with his friends that their explanations are wrong.
Yep.
Right. And then at the end, we get God saying, hey, Job did this right. Friends, you did this wrong. And there's a chunk where he reminds Job who he is, right?
Yep.
But he says, Job did it right. Friends, you did it wrong. And then he doesn't give an answer, right? So to me, that says there's not an answer necessarily, right? God says, I'm with you in this, even if there's not a simple solution. And his friends had it right for the first couple of days, where they just said, hey, I get it. I'm going to sit in silence and grieve with you. I'm just going to be here, And I think we holding the tension of there is hope and joy in like the Christian life, and also there is pain and sadness.
And suffering. And Jesus said there would be a lot of it.
And we don't like holding the tension of those two at the same time.
Yep.
And
we
so
want to fix things.
So we say, this is bad, but I have hope in God. Listen, that doesn't need to be a but. It can be an and. There is hope in Jesus. There's hope in God. And this is really painful. And I think if we could make that shift of those can both be true, we would probably have a lot less people who said, well, I tried to talk to so-and-so about it and they just threw Bible verses at me.
Yep.
And now I feel worse because I, quote unquote, should be feeling joy.
Because that's the disconnect there, because people don't feel heard. And I always tell people, helping people process their pain is real easy. Just listen. That's what you have to do. People have to talk it through. They have to pour it out. They have, I liken it to having to throw up. And when you're sick and you have the flu, I would rather die than throw up personally. But I'll fight it for days. I can count on one hand how many times as an adult, I'm 61, that I've actually thrown up. And so I think we in the church, we're so uncomfortable with that we just keep piling faith stuff on top of it. And it's
Yeah.
not, and what we do is teach people to hold in their pain. And my experience with life is if you don't deal with your pain deals with you.
Yeah.
Sooner or later.
Yeah. There's a couple people that I know and trust talk about moving through pain instead of kind of moving around it or moving past it, right? Getting over it,
right?
But moving through it.
Yep.
And you can come out on the other side, but that requires the chunk of I'm moving through this and experiencing it versus, well, I'm just going to
exactly
ignore this thing.
Or if I do these 3 things, I'll get through this or around it, and I don't have to feel as much.
Right. Yeah.
Man, our time is just drawn to a close here way too fast. I hope that I can talk to you again, especially about the suicide stuff and prevention, because I think a webinar would be great for faith leaders and others in regards to just where do you go for some training? How do you get versed in this enough to not be afraid of it? Because I think we're going to see more and more of that in the church. Unfortunately, in our culture, it's getting worse. It's not getting better. And we as Christians have the hope that people need. And I always say when you plug in practical hope and how hope happens and you put faith in there, it's sure and certain that God can take our pain, our brokenness, and make it for our good. He can turn it around. That doesn't make it easy.
Yeah.
So I want to thank you so much. We'll get another one lined up.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so if you don't mind, would you just, for the person who's listening to this, who's saying, I am in the pits of despair, or my life is so broken, I feel like I can't go on. Talk to them, if you would. Just speak into their lives' hope, and then pray for them, if you would.
Yeah. I would say if you're in that kind of place, right, regardless of kind of what quote unquote level of pain it is, because there's not, comparing pain isn't ever helpful. But I would say you're definitely not alone in that, right? That there's other people who are going through similar things. There's people who have come out on the other side of those things, and that's not meant to disqualify yours in any way as a unique experience, because we all experience everything as individuals and in our own way, but maybe to offer a sense of that you're not the only one, right? There's people that know and that see that and that see you and that want to hear that and that want to listen and help. And these aren't things that you need to just try to kind of, bootstrap it and go through on your own, that there is help and hope available in a number of ways. And if you've tried to find that and it hasn't worked well for you so far, I'm really sorry, because I know what that feels like, but, not to give up. I think there's a God that loves you. There's people that love you and that want to love you well and better. And I would just say that to hold on to hope in whatever sense that looks like to you, and not to use that as like a way to kind of spiritually bypass the pain, but to know that in the midst of pain that God exists there, and that community can exist there as well. But those things don't disqualify each other. And so, don't feel like you have to pretend like pain isn't pain just to hang on to any sense of hope. I'll pray if that's...
Thank you. Yeah. Great.
Jesus, we thank you for this conversation. I thank you for Pastor Brad and the ministry that he's doing and his whole team, just offering hope to people in the midst of what we know are very hard and painful places and times and seasons. I thank you that one of the names you go by is Emmanuel, which is just God with us, right? It doesn't mean that we need to go somewhere else to find you, but even in the midst of our broken places, that you are there with us. And I would ask that you help people to feel that, a sense of that in their hardest places, their darkest times. We know what it feels like to be hopeless. A lot of us do. I just invite you into that for everyone, that you meet them there, and that they know through that they are so loved, that they matter, that they're invaluable, that they are a child of you, that they matter to the world, they matter to the God of the universe, and that their pain matters too, and that you can use that to grow something, or whatever it is that you would do with that, but that you are there with us in our pain. And I just thank you for that. And it is in your name I pray. Amen.
Amen. Amen. Well, thank you so much, Robert. I really appreciate. I want to make sure everybody knows how to find you online, and if Robert-Vore, VORE.com. So V like Victor. So in case you have a hearing problem like I do, you didn't know if I said B or D or V.
Yeah.
But Robert-Vore, VORE.com. And you can click on there or go to his website and find the podcast and other resources and training. And please check out their podcast. And there you would go to CXMHpodcast.com, CXMHpodcast.com, or you can find that on Robert's website as well.
Yeah.
So it's just amazing how God is starting to network and connect people in the faith community in regards to helping build bridges between mental health and that intersection that your podcast covers. And for that, I'm so grateful as a person who has bipolar disorder myself to really say thank you to you guys for being willing to do more than just help. And I don't mean more, but helping one-on-one is incredible, but the masses need help too. Many of us need help in helping other people. So thank you so much for doing that. And thank you for your willingness to be transparent about your own journey in this process. I appreciate your time.
Absolutely. And again, thank you for all the work you're doing and for having me on.
Yeah, thank you. Well, my friend, we want to thank you for listening to this edition of Fresh Hope for Mental Health. I pray that it's been helpful to you. I believe it is. I believe that probably the most important thing you can do is find out more by going to robert-vore.com and to check out the podcast, in particular, CXMH. We really want to hear from you here at Fresh Hope. Email your comments, questions, and insights to info@freshhope.us. You can always leave a voicemail, too, on our podcast website, which is freshhopeformentalhealth.com. And, of course, we want to connect with you in any way that we can. And if you wouldn't mind doing us a favor, if you're receiving our podcast through iTunes, would you mind writing an honest review of the program? We'd really appreciate that because that helps others find it faster on iTunes. We have books, we have groups, we have other materials, all that you can find at freshhope.us. And more than anything, I want you to know that the Lord God Almighty is with you. He loves you. And the most important thing is to just hold on to the fact that He's with you. And if we can be of help in any way, please let us know. Until the next time, may He fill you with His hope, fresh and new daily. I'm Brad Hoefs, and this is another edition of Fresh Hope for Mental Health.
You've been listening to Fresh Hope for Mental Health. If you have an opportunity, please review, share, and subscribe to the Fresh Hope for Mental Health podcast on iTunes or on the service that you use. We encourage you to share our podcast on social media with your friends and family. Previous podcasts of Fresh Hope for Mental Health can be found at freshhopeformentalhealth.com, iHeartRadio, Stitcher Radio, and iTunes. The Fresh Hope for Mental Health podcast is part of Fresh Hope. Fresh Hope is an international network of Christian mental health peer support groups which empower people to live well in spite of having a mental health diagnosis. For more information about Fresh Hope, go to freshhope.us. Fresh Hope is one of the leading networks of faith-based peer support groups internationally. Our host, Brad Hoefs, is founder and president of Fresh Hope. He is a pastor who is living well in spite of having bipolar disorder. Brad is the author of the book Fresh Hope for Living Well, which is available at Amazon.com. Brad is also a speaker, blogger, hope coach, and mental health advocate. You can find more out about Brad by going to bradhoefs.com. Hoefs is spelled Hoefs. If you or someone you know is interested in attending a Fresh Hope group meeting, go to freshhope.us and click on Find a Group. Not only do we have local groups, but we also offer Fresh Hope groups online also. If you're interested in starting a Fresh Hope group in your community, email us at info@freshhope.us.